So if you look at almost any system of energy we've ever created as a species, it all really comes down to a very simple, very unforgiving rule of physics.
Right, which is basically, you burn something up and it's gone.
Exactly.
It's gone. It's just the basic reality of consumption. I mean, you put coal in a furnace, you break the chemical bonds to get heat, and, well, you're left with a pile of ash and a bunch of carbon dioxide.
Yeah, or you put gasoline in your car, it combusts, you get motion, and you're just left with exhaust. It's a strictly one-way street.
Yeah, a one-way street that kind of defines the bottleneck of modern civilization, honestly.
Right. The entire history of human industrialization is basically just us desperately finding new fuel, burning it as fast as we can, and then trying to figure out where to hide all the waste.
We are constantly racing against depletion, like constantly.
But so imagine a machine that fundamentally breaks that rule, just completely shatters it. Picture a wood-burning stove where, as the fire burns and heats your house, the leftover ash somehow miraculously transforms into brand new, perfectly chopped firewood.
Which sounds completely ridiculous.
Right. In fact, it produces more firewood than you originally put in.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a flat-out violation of the laws of thermodynamics. It sounds like literal alchemy.
It sounds totally impossible.
Oh.
But on April 6, 2026, on this flat stretch of coastline in Tamil Nadu, India, that exact kind of alchemy actually became a reality.
It really did.
Yeah. A facility known as the Prototype Fast Breeder Reactor, or PFBR, which is located at Kalpakkam, attained something called first criticality.
Which is a huge deal.
A massive deal.
Yeah.
And this isn't just a win for the Indian power grid,
Right.
We're talking about a technology so notoriously difficult, so fraught with these chemical and engineering nightmares, that the United States, France, and Japan all poured billions upon billions of dollars into it before just throwing their hands up and walking away entirely.
And I think that is the real mystery here for anyone looking at this.
Yeah, exactly. The mission for our deep dive today is to really figure that out. You have to ask yourself, why persist?
Right. Why did India just spend 22 years and face these massive cost overruns to build a machine when the richest nations on Earth decided the engineering was simply too brutal to master?
So to unpack this, we have a massive stack of sources today. We're pulling from official press releases from the Press Information Bureau and the Department of Atomic Energy.
We also have some really fascinating historical analyses from the Indira Gandhi Center for Atomic Research.
Yep, and a few global nuclear energy reports that help put this entire achievement into a much wider, frankly, mind-bending context. We are just here to break down what these sources are saying and impartially share the facts because, honestly, the technology speaks for itself.
Absolutely.
But before we get into the global graveyard of failed reactors, let's start with April 6th itself, because the press releases all proudly state that the Kalpakkam reactor achieved first criticality. Now, to anyone outside the nuclear physics community, the word critical sounds terrifying. It sounds like, a critical medical condition or a critical failure.
Yeah, it is a terrible piece of branding, honestly.
Right.
Because in nuclear terminology, criticality has absolutely nothing to do with a crisis. It is actually a highly precise, deeply desired, and incredibly stable state.
Okay, so what is it actually?
Well, criticality is simply the exact threshold where a nuclear fission chain reaction becomes self-sustaining.
Okay, let's unpack this. So we're talking about the domino effect, like one atom splits, releasing neutrons. Those neutrons hit other atoms, they split, and so on.
Yes, exactly. But the math has to be perfect. Think about the physics of a fission event inside a reactor core.
Okay.
An atom of heavy uranium splits. It releases a massive burst of heat, which we obviously want, and it kicks out, on average, 2 or 3 new neutrons.
Right, the subatomic shrapnel, basically.
Exactly. Now, for the reaction to continue, at least one of those newly released neutrons needs to go on and hit another uranium atom.
But wait, if all 3 neutrons hit other atoms, then those 3 split and release 9 and then 27 and
then you have an exponential curve.
which is a bomb.
Right, which is exactly what you engineer the power reactor to avoid at all costs.
So how do they stop that exponential growth?
You use control rods. They're usually made of materials like boron or cadmium that act like giant neutron sponges to absorb the excess. You want an effective neutron multiplication factor of exactly 1.0.
Meaning 1 to 1?
Yeah. That means for every atom that splits, exactly 1 neutron goes on to split exactly 1 more atom. Criticality is that perfect equilibrium.
Oh, I see.
The number of neutrons produced perfectly equals the number of neutrons lost. The reaction isn't accelerating and it isn't fizzling out, it's just stable.
So it's like driving a car on the highway.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Achieving criticality is basically like keeping the car at a perfectly steady 60 miles per hour.
Hmm.
You're balancing the pressure on the gas pedal with the friction of the road and the wind resistance.
Yeah.
You aren't speeding up, you aren't slowing down, you're just holding the needle steady.
It is like a car on the highway, yes, but imagine you're driving an 18-wheeler on black ice while balancing a glass of water on the dashboard.
Oh, wow. Okay, so the margins are tight.
Incredibly tight. So when the PFBR reached first criticality, it meant the engineers successfully established that steady, controlled, self-sustaining chain reaction for the very first time. They found that perfect balance point.
It's like the fundamental heartbeat of the reactor.
Exactly. It's the baseline requirement before it can even think about generating commercial power.
Okay, so we have a working, stable nuclear heartbeat. But the PFBR isn't just a standard power plant. The FB stands for Fast Breeder. Let's go back to my wood stove analogy for a second. How does a fast breeder reactor actually breed more fuel than it consumes? Because, I mean, to a layperson, bathing useless rock in radiation just sounds like a recipe for making highly radioactive useless rock.
Yeah, it does sound a bit counterintuitive. To understand the actual mechanism of breeding, we have to look really closely at the atomic structure of the fuel itself.
Okay.
Because the physics here fundamentally break the rules of how almost every other commercial reactor on Earth operates.
That's so.
It all comes down to the bizarre disparity between the isotopes of natural uranium.
Wait, natural uranium isn't just one uniform thing.
Not at all. When you pull uranium ore out of the ground, it is essentially a mixture of two totally different isotopes. About 99.3% of it is uranium-238.
99.3%. That is almost the entire rock.
Almost all of it, yeah. And uranium-238 is what physicists call fertile.
Fertile, meaning what?
Meaning it has the potential to be involved in nuclear reactions, but you cannot spark a self-sustaining chain reaction with it. It just won't burn in a standard reactor.
Oh.
The stuff we actually want, the fissile material that eagerly splits and powers almost every nuclear plant on the grid today, is uranium-235.
And how much of the rock is that?
Uranium-235 makes up a miserable 0.7% of natural uranium.
That is a staggering disparity. It's like mining a ton of coal just to get a handful of usable dust.
It is deeply inefficient. And conventional reactors, you know, the ones operating in the US, France, and most of the world, they're designed to only extract that tiny 0.7% of uranium-235.
Okay, so how do they do that?
To do this, they rely on a moderator, which is usually just ordinary water.
Wait, really? I always thought the water was just there to cool the reactor down so it doesn't melt. It actually plays a role in the physics.
A vital role. You see, when a uranium-235 atom splits, the neutrons it shoots out are moving incredibly fast. We're talking around 20,000 kilometers per second.
That's fast.
Very fast. Now, here is the really counterintuitive part of nuclear physics. A fast-moving neutron actually has a very hard time splitting another uranium-235 atom.
Why? You'd think a faster projectile would do way more damage.
You would think so, but it's about quantum probability and interaction time. The neutron is moving so fast that it just zips right past the nucleus before the strong nuclear force can even grab it.
Oh, so it just blows right by.
Exactly. So to increase the probability of a collision, you actually have to slow the neutron down. That is what the water does. It moderates the speed.
Okay, but how does water slow down a subatomic particle?
Think of it like billiards.
Okay.
If you shoot a cue ball into a heavy bowling ball, the cue ball bounces off, but it keeps most of its speed.
Right.
But if you shoot a cue ball into another billiard ball of the exact same size and mass, the kinetic energy transfers perfectly, and the cue ball slows down dramatically.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. A water molecule is H2O. Those two hydrogen atoms have a nucleus consisting of a single proton, which is almost the exact same mass as a neutron. So the fast neutrons smash into the hydrogen in the water, transfer their energy like billiard balls, and slow down.
Precisely. They become what we call thermal or slow neutrons, which are then easily captured by those rare uranium-235 atoms, keeping the chain reaction going.
Wow. Okay, but by filling the core with water to hunt for that tiny 0.7% of U-235, what happens to the other 99.3% of the uranium, the U-238?
Just sits there.
Just sits there.
Yeah. It is largely dead weight. In a conventional water-cooled reactor, you extract about 1% of the potential energy from the raw uranium, and the remaining 99% basically becomes highly toxic nuclear waste that you have to bury in a mountain somewhere.
That is insane. It's literally like buying a massive steak, eating one bite, and throwing the rest in the trash.
It is. And that horrific inefficiency is exactly the problem the fast breeder reactor was invented to solve.
Okay, so how does it solve it?
The breeder solution relies on a process called transmutation. And to achieve transmutation, you have to remove the water entirely.
No water at all. You cannot use a moderator. You need those neutrons to stay incredibly fast and highly energetic.
Hence the name, fast breeder.
Exactly.
So what does the core of the calpacum reactor actually look like then, if it doesn't use standard fuel and water?
The central core of the PFBR uses a mixed oxide, or MOX, fuel.
MOX.
Okay? Yeah, this is a highly concentrated, intensely radioactive mixture of plutonium and uranium. This small, dense core is where the primary chain reaction happens, firing off massive amounts of unmoderated, fast neutrons.
Right.
Now, surrounding this active core is what engineers call a blanket. And this blanket is made entirely of that otherwise useless uranium-238.
The 99.3% that conventional reactors just throw away.
Exactly. So these fast, high-energy neutrons escape the central plutonium core and smash into this dense blanket of uranium-238.
And because they're moving so fast, what happens?
Well, because they're moving so fast, the U-238 doesn't split. Instead, the U-238 nucleus simply absorbs the fast neutron.
It just swallows it whole.
Yeah.
But wait, how does getting heavier turn it into fuel?
This is where the alchemy happens. When uranium-238 swallows a neutron, it becomes uranium-239.
Okay.
But uranium-239 is highly unstable. It really wants to find a stable energy state. So within minutes, it undergoes a radioactive process called beta decay.
Okay, let's unpack beta decay, because I hear that term thrown around a lot of these sources. But what is physically happening inside that atom?
Well, at a subatomic level, a neutron is made of quarks, specifically 2 down quarks and 1 up quark.
Okay, tracking.
In beta decay, the weak nuclear force causes one of those down quarks to suddenly flip and become an up quark.
And what does that do?
When that happens, the neutron physically transforms into a proton. It spits out an electron and an antineutrino in the process.
Wait, if it gains a proton, it changes its atomic number. Right, so it's not uranium anymore.
Exactly. By gaining a proton, the atom transmutes into a completely different element on the periodic table. It becomes neptunium-239.
Mind-bending.
But it doesn't stop there, because neptunium-239 is also unstable. A couple of days later, it undergoes a second beta decay. Another neutron turns into a proton.
Which moves it up the periodic table again.
Yes, it transmutes into plutonium-239.
And plutonium-239 is?
It is brand new, highly potent, weapons-grade capable, fissile nuclear fuel.
That is just unbelievable. You are literally bombarding useless rock with fast neutrons, changing its subatomic quark structure, and turning it into premium nuclear fuel.
It's a completely self-reinforcing cycle. In a perfectly tuned breeder reactor, for every atom of fuel you split in the core to generate electricity, the escaping fast neutrons convert the uranium-238 in the blanket into more than 1 new atom of plutonium.
So it actually makes more than it burns.
Over its operating cycle, yes, it produces more fissile material than it consumes.
Okay, I'm sold on the physics. The math is beautiful.
Right.
But I have a massive, glaring logistical question here.
Sure, what is it?
You said earlier that you absolutely cannot use water in this reactor because water slows down neutrons, which ruins the fast neutron transmutation process.
That's correct.
But we are talking about a highly concentrated plutonium core undergoing a massive nuclear chain reaction. It must get unbelievably hot in there.
Oh, incredibly hot.
So if you can't use water to cool it, how do you keep the core from just melting into a puddle of radioactive slag?
And you have just hit on the exact engineering hurdle that defines this entire technology.
Really?
Yeah. You need a coolant fluid that can absorb massive violent amounts of heat, but that has a heavy enough atomic mass that neutrons will just bounce off it without losing their speed.
So hydrogen is out because it's too light.
Right. Water is totally out. So the only truly viable solution for large-scale, efficient, fast reactors is to submerge the entire core in liquid metal.
Liquid metal.
Specifically liquid sodium.
Liquid sodium. I remember sodium from high school chemistry, and it did not seem like a friendly element.
It isn't friendly at all. Sodium is a soft, silvery metal at room temperature, but when you heat it above 98 degrees Celsius, it melts into a liquid that looks and flows a lot like water or mercury. Now, from a purely thermodynamic standpoint, liquid sodium is a miracle fluid. It conducts heat incredibly well, far better than water. It pulls the thermal energy away from the nuclear core with astonishing efficiency.
But what about boiling? Because if a reactor coolant boils away, that's when you get a meltdown, right?
And that is the second massive advantage of sodium. See, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. To keep water in a liquid state at the 300 or 400 degree temperatures inside a conventional nuclear reactor, you have to keep the entire system under immense, terrifying pressure.
Like how much pressure?
Often 150 times normal atmospheric pressure. Conventional reactors are basically giant, heavily armored pressure cookers. If a pipe breaks, the water instantly flashes to steam, which causes massive expansion problems.
Right, that's the classic meltdown scenario we always hear about.
Exactly. But liquid sodium doesn't boil until it reaches about 880 degrees Celsius.
Oh, wow. That's high.
Since the PFBR operates at around 550 degrees, the sodium stays comfortably liquid, which means a sodium-cooled fast reactor can operate at near normal atmospheric pressure.
So it's not trying to explode outwards.
Right. There is no massive pressure trying to burst the pipes. You don't need pressure vessels with walls a foot thick.
Okay, and what about the neutrons? How do they react to the sodium?
Well, sodium has an atomic mass of 23. It's much heavier than the hydrogen in water. So when a fast neutron smashes into a sodium atom, it's like a cue ball hitting a bowling ball.
Like the billiards analogy again.
Yeah. The neutron bounces off, but it retains almost all of its velocity. The neutrons stay fast, allowing the breeding process in the blanket to continue seamlessly.
Wow. So if we step back and look at the whole picture for a second, instead of extracting 1% of the energy from uranium and burying the rest as waste for thousands of years, a fast breeder reactor can theoretically extract 60 to 70% of the energy by constantly transmuting the waste back into fuel.
Exactly.
It multiplies the energy potential of our global uranium supply by a factor of 60.
It represents hundreds, potentially thousands of years of clean baseline energy for the human race without needing to mine significantly more uranium.
Okay, honestly, listening to you explain this, liquid sodium sounds like the perfect engineering cheat code. Like, it cools efficiently, it operates safely at low pressure, and it allows us to multiply our fuel supply by 60. It sounds like a literal silver bullet for climate change.
It really does sound that way on paper.
But I know for a fact that it isn't. Because if it was that easy, every country in the world would have 50 of these reactors on their grid right now.
You're absolutely right to be skeptical. The physics of breeding are elegant and beautiful, but the engineering of liquid sodium is a waking nightmare.
A nightmare.
It is one of the most unforgiving substances on Earth to work with industrially.
Let's talk about the danger then. Why is sodium a nightmare?
Because of its chemical reactivity. Liquid sodium reacts violently and often explosively upon contact with air or water.
Oh, right. High school chemistry.
Yeah. If you have a small leak in a conventional water-cooled reactor, you get a puddle of mildly radioactive water on the floor. It's an incident, sure, but it's manageable. You mop it up, you clean it up. But if you have a leak of liquid sodium at 500 degrees Celsius, the second it touches the oxygen and moisture in the ambient air, it instantly combusts into a fierce, intensely hot chemical fire.
Just from touching air.
Yes. And if it comes into contact with liquid water, the reaction liberates hydrogen gas and immediately detonates.
So let me get this straight. To solve our global fuel problem, we are taking a highly concentrated nuclear core and we're submerging it in a swimming pool of molten metal that acts like a gremlin the second it touches normal air or water. Who signed off on this?
It requires a level of engineering paranoia that is genuinely hard to overstate. Every single pipe, every valve, every heat exchanger has to be perfectly sealed.
I can't even imagine.
You usually have to build double-walled pipes, like a pipe inside a pipe, just in case the inner one leaks. And you have to blanket the entire top of the sodium pool with an inert gas, usually argon, so the sodium never, ever touches oxygen.
And I imagine inspecting these pipes is incredibly difficult if they're literally submerged in liquid metal.
It's worse than difficult. Liquid sodium is completely opaque. It looks like liquid silver. You cannot see through it at all.
Right, it's a metal.
In a water reactor, if you want to check if a fuel rod is seated correctly or look for a crack, you can literally shine a light and look through a window or use a standard optical camera. In a sodium reactor, you are entirely blind.
So how do you do maintenance? How do you even load the fuel if you can't see anything?
Every piece of maintenance, every single fuel transfer has to be done blindly, relying entirely on complex ultrasonic sensors.
Like sonar on a submarine.
Exactly like sonar. Since light can't pass through the metal, they use high-frequency sound waves. The sound waves bounce off the density differences between the steel components and the liquid sodium, creating this highly complex topological map.
That sounds incredibly tedious.
Engineers have to use these acoustic maps to guide incredibly precise, specialized robotics, all operating while submerged in a highly radioactive, opaque liquid metal at 500 degrees Celsius. The margins for error are effectively zero.
Wow. If the margin for error is zero, what happens when humans inevitably make an error?
You get a multi-billion-dollar catastrophe. If you look at the global history of fast breeder reactors across our sources, you are essentially walking through a graveyard of the world's most advanced technological powers.
Let's walk the listener through that graveyard. Let's start with Japan because they are renowned for their precision engineering. What happened with their breeder program?
Japan's experience is a classic, tragic, cautionary tale. Japan imports almost all of its energy, right? So a reactor that breeds its own fuel was the ultimate dream for their grid.
Makes total sense for them.
They started building a prototype fast breeder named Monju in 1985. They spent over a decade constructing it.
And did it work?
Well, it reached criticality in 1994, but in December 1995, disaster struck. It wasn't a nuclear failure, though. It was a mundane engineering flaw.
What happened?
A thermocouple, which is essentially an industrial thermometer, was inserted into a pipe to measure the sodium temperature. But the engineers miscalculated the fluid dynamics. The flow of the heavy liquid sodium caused the thermometer to vibrate.
Oh.
Yeah, over time, metal fatigue set in, and the thermometer just snapped off.
Which created a hole in the pipe.
Yes. Nearly 3 tons of liquid sodium leaked out.
3 tons.
And the moment it hit the air in the secondary cooling loop, it caught fire. It burned at over 700 degrees Celsius.
Oh my God.
The burning sodium reacted with moisture in the air to create highly corrosive sodium hydroxide aerosols, which literally began eating through the steel ventilation ducts and floor gratings.
Was there a radiation leak? That sounds apocalyptic.
Fortunately, no. The leak was in the secondary cooling loop, which transfers heat away from the primary radioactive loop, so the public was physically safe.
Okay, well that's something.
But the political and administrative fallout was a total meltdown. The operating agency actually tried to cover up the extent of the damage. They literally edited the video footage of the fire before showing it to the public.
You're kidding. A cover-up is the absolute worst thing you can do in the nuclear industry.
It completely paralyzed them. When that was discovered, public trust just evaporated overnight. Japan spent the next 2 decades in regulatory purgatory, mired in lawsuits, safety reviews, and endless debates.
Did they ever turn it back on?
They tried to briefly restart Monju in 2010, but immediately dropped another heavy piece of equipment into the reactor vessel, which caused even more delays. Finally, in 2016, the Japanese government just threw in the towel and ordered the permanent decommissioning of the reactor.
How much did that entire debacle cost the Japanese taxpayers? An estimated $12 billion US.
$12 billion.
And for that $12 billion over a span of 30 years, Monju generated electricity for the grid for a total of exactly 1 hour.
1 hour of electricity for $12 billion. That is honestly nauseating.
It's a huge loss. What about the United States? The U.S. basically invented nuclear power. Didn't they pioneer this?
They did. In fact, the first nuclear reactor in the history of the world to ever generate usable electricity was a fast breeder reactor.
Really?
Yeah, it was called EBRI, built in the desert of Idaho back in 1951. It proved the concept was physically possible. But moving from a small proof of concept to a massive commercial grid-scale reactor proved disastrously expensive.
Because scaling up that sodium containment gets exponentially harder.
Exactly. The amount of custom engineering, the double-walled piping, the argon gas systems, the safety redundancies, it all means fast breeder reactors typically cost 2 to 3 times more to build than a standard water-cooled reactor.
Did the U.S. ever try to build a big one?
They did. The U.S. government aggressively pursued this in the 1970s with the Clinch River Breeder Reactor project in Tennessee. They poured billions into it.
So what killed Clinch River? Was it a sodium fire like in Japan?
No, Clinch River was killed by a combination of economics and geopolitical anxiety. Fast breeders, by design, produce high-quality plutonium-239.
Right, you're transmuting it.
Right. And in the late 70s, under President Jimmy Carter, There was massive anxiety about nuclear proliferation. The fear was that if breeder reactors became common, rivers of commercial plutonium would be flowing around the globe, making it incredibly easy for rogue nations or terrorists to build nuclear weapons.
Right, because you are literally running a plutonium factory.
Exactly. Carter actually banned the commercial reprocessing of plutonium in the U.S.
Oh, wow.
The project kind of limped along into the Reagan administration, but by 1983, Congress looked at the skyrocketing multi-billion-dollar cost estimates. They also realized that large new deposits of natural uranium had been discovered globally.
Meaning the price of standard fuel crashed.
Yep, it was suddenly very cheap to just run standard water reactors. The economic case for a massively expensive breeder just vanished, so Congress canceled Clinch River in 1983 after spending an estimated $15 billion on the broader breeder program.
So the U.S. walked away because it was too expensive and too politically risky. What about Europe? Did they try?
France made the biggest push with a massive 1,200-megawatt breeder called Superphénix. It was an absolute engineering leviathan, but it was plagued from day one.
Plagued by what?
Mostly fierce, militant political opposition. At one point in 1982, anti-nuclear protesters literally fired rocket-propelled grenades at the construction site.
You're carrying RPGs in France.
Yes, they missed the critical components, but it shows the level of tension. And once it was finally built, Superphénix suffered multiple highly complex sodium leaks, including a major leak in a fuel storage drum that took years to diagnose and repair.
Sounds like a nightmare.
The operational costs were astronomical. In 1997, the French government finally succumbed to political pressure and the horrific balance sheet and just shut it down permanently.
Did any other European countries try?
Germany built a breeder, the SNR 300. It took 19 years and billions of marks to build. It was completely finished, ready to go. But due to safety panics following the Chernobyl disaster and local political resistance, it was never even switched on.
Never turned on. What did they do with it?
They abandoned it and eventually turned the site into an amusement park.
An amusement park. You cannot make this up.
The UK also abandoned their breeder program at Donray when the government pulled the funding.
It really is a staggering graveyard. You have $12 billion wasted in Japan, $15 billion in the U.S., massive abandoned multi-billion-dollar projects in France, Germany, and the U.K. Every major Western power that tried to climb this technological mountain got bruised, went bankrupt, and fell off.
With one major exception.
No.
Russia held its nerve. They are currently the only nation on Earth operating commercial-scale fast reactors, the BN600 and BN800 models.
Oh, interesting.
And China, seeing the strategic value, is aggressively pursuing the technology right now with their CFR 600 project. And now, with the CalPAC and PFBR achieving criticality, India officially joins this highly exclusive, very small club.
Which brings us back to the central mystery of this entire deep dive.
Right.
If the U.S., Japan, France, and Germany all gave up because it was a sodium-soaked nightmare, and to be clear, our sources show India's PFBR was not a smooth ride at all.
Not at all.
It suffered a crushing 22-year delay and 134% cost overrun, ballooning from roughly 3,500 crore rupees to over 8,100 crore rupees.
Massive overruns.
So why did India persist? Why endure decades of setbacks to build a machine that broke so many other nations?
The answer is entirely dictated by the unforgiving reality of geology. India's motivation is fundamentally different from the U.S. or France. They aren't doing this as a science experiment. They are doing this out of absolute existential necessity.
Because of resources?
Yes. It comes down to a stark resource disparity.
Break down the resources for us. What was India looking at?
Well, India has a rapidly expanding population of over 1.4 billion people, right? And an economy that is industrializing at a breakneck pace. Their demand for baseload electricity is insatiable.
Sure.
However, India holds only about 1 to 2% of the world's known economically extractable uranium reserves.
1 to 2%. That is essentially a rounding error. I mean, if you base your entire national grid on standard water-cooled reactors that burn uranium, you are forever dependent on importing fuel from countries like Australia, Canada, or Kazakhstan.
Exactly. You have zero energy sovereignty. You are at the mercy of global supply chains, geopolitical sanctions, and price shocks.
Right.
But nature played a very fascinating trick on the Indian subcontinent. While they are practically starved for uranium, India holds roughly 25% of the entire world's reserves of thorium.
Wait, 25%? A quarter of the global supply?
Yes.
Where is it all hiding?
Massive, massive deposits of thorium are found in the monazite sands along the coastal regions of South India, particularly in the states of Kerala and Tamil Nadu. It is literally washing up on their beaches.
So you have a nation starving for uranium, but sitting on a geopolitical gold mine of thorium.
Precisely. And this geopolitical reality was recognized very early on, right after India gained independence.
By who?
In the 1950s, the visionary architect of India's nuclear program, Dr. Homi J. Bhabha, looked at these resources and drafted a brilliant, audacious, multi-generational master plan.
Okay, let's unpack this plan.
He knew India couldn't rely on the standard Western model of burning imported uranium. The math just didn't work. He had to figure out how to burn domestic thorium.
But thorium isn't like uranium, right? You can't just dig it up, crush into a pellet, and drop it into a standard reactor.
No, you can't, and that is the massive hurdle. Thorium-232 is completely non-fissile.
Wait, if it isn't fissile, it can't split. It can't sustain a chain reaction.
That's exact.
It's basically like wet wood.
That is a perfect analogy. If you pack a reactor core full of pure thorium, absolutely nothing will happen. It will not catch fire on its own.
So how do you use it?
To make thorium useful, you have to transmute it, you have to bombard it with neutrons so it absorbs one, undergoes beta decay, and transforms into a brand new isotope, uranium-233.
Ah, and uranium-233 is fissile.
Highly fissile, it is a fantastic nuclear fuel. But uranium-233 does not exist in nature. It must be artificially bred inside a reactor.
So if Bhabha knows he has a mountain of thorium that is completely useless unless he breeds it, but he has no advanced reactors to breed it with, he has a massive chicken and egg problem. How do you start the fire if all your wood is wet?
You have to bootstrap it. And that is the genius of Dr. Bhabha's three-stage nuclear power program. It is essentially a multi-decade technological staircase. You absolutely must climb one stage to unlock the next. You can't skip a step.
Okay, let's walk through this multi-generational plan. If stage 3 is the ultimate goal of burning thorium, what is stage 1?
Yeah.
I'm guessing stage 1 has to involve using that tiny 1% of natural uranium just to get a spark.
You're exactly right. Stage 1 utilizes the limited natural uranium India actually possesses within its borders. India spent the last few decades building a fleet of pressurized heavy water reactors, or PHWRs.
Yeah.
They currently have about 19 of these operating across the country. These reactors use heavy water to moderate neutrons, and they burn natural, unenriched uranium to generate baseline electricity for the grid.
But generating electricity isn't the only goal of stage 1, is it? Because burning that uranium creates waste.
Exactly, and in Bhabha's plan, there is no such thing as waste. As those stage 1 reactors burn the natural uranium, the U-238 inside the fuel rods absorbs some thermal neutrons and slowly breeds a byproduct, plutonium-239.
Oh. So stage 1 is essentially a massive, slow-moving factory designed to manufacture and stockpile plutonium.
Yes, which leads directly to stage 2.
The fast breeder reactor phase.
Yes, this is the exact phase that the Kalpakkam PFBR has just inaugurated. The strategy here is to take the plutonium that was patiently stockpiled from stage 1, mix it with depleted uranium, the leftover U-238, and put it into the liquid sodium-cooled fast breeder.
And because it's a fast breeder, it takes that initial batch of plutonium and breeds more plutonium. It exponentially multiplies the fissile fuel inventory.
Correct. You use the stage 2 breeders to grow your plutonium stockpile to the point where you have enough fuel to build a whole fleet of fast breeder reactors.
That's brilliant.
But multiplying plutonium is only half the job. Stage 2 has a second, even more critical purpose. It is the mandatory, non-negotiable bridge to the ultimate goal. Stage 3.
The thorium-based reactors.
Exactly. You cannot simply decide to build a stage 3 thorium reactor tomorrow. You need a massive initial charge of uranium-233 to spark the chain reaction. And as we discussed, uranium-233 doesn't exist yet.
So how does the Kalpakkam reactor actually bridge that gap? Let's do a deep dive into the mechanics of stage 2. How does this liquid sodium machine prepare India for thorium?
It goes back to the concept of the blanket surrounding the core that we talked about. Right now, for its initial operations, the Kalpakkam PFBR is using a blanket made of uranium-238.
Right, to breed more plutonium.
Yeah, but the reactor architecture is deliberately designed so that eventually, once they have enough plutonium, they can physically open the reactor and swap out that uranium blanket.
Swapping it out for a blanket made of the beach sand. Thorium.
Yes. They will surround the plutonium core with a blanket of thorium-232, and this is where the alchemy reaches its final form.
So the neutrons hit the thorium.
Yes. The intense flux of fast, unmoderated neutrons will escape the core and bombard the thorium blanket. The thorium will swallow those neutrons, undergo those beta decays we talked about, and slowly transmute into uranium-233.
So the fast breeder isn't just an energy source. It is literally an alchemical engine designed to convert India's massive, unusable thorium reserves into the specific required Stage 3 fuel.
Precisely. Without Kalpakkam and the fleet of breeders that will follow it, the entire three-stage dream stalls forever. There is no other economically viable way to generate the U-233 at scale.
And that explains the persistence.
Yeah. That is why India absorbed the 22-year delay. That is why they didn't flinch at the 134% cost overrun. They weren't just building a power plant, they were buying the indispensable tea to their entire energy future for the next 400 years.
Wow. If they gave up on sodium like the Americans or the Japanese did, the thorium dream dies with it.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes the stakes incredibly clear. So Kalpakkam just hit criticality. The chain reaction is balanced and stable. What happens tomorrow? Do they just ramp the power up to 100%, plug it into the grid, and start powering homes and factories in Chennai?
Oh, not even close.
No.
Criticality is just the starting gun of a marathon. What happens next is a grueling, hyper-cautious phase of low-power physics experiments.
What kind of experiments?
For the next several months, the engineers will operate the reactor at incredibly low power levels, like fractions of a percent of its total capacity.
Why so slow? If the reaction is stable, why not just open the throttle?
Because this is a first-of-its-kind 500-megawatt liquid metal machine for India. The physics inside are incredibly complex.
Right, the whole opaque liquid sodium thing.
Yeah, they have massive supercomputer models predicting exactly how the liquid sodium will flow, how the fuel assemblies will physically expand as they heat up, and exactly how the neutron flux will distribute across the core. Now, they have to meticulously prove that physical reality matches those computer models perfectly.
Validating the math.
They will introduce tiny temperature changes and record millions of data points to ensure there are no microscopic anomalies.
I assume there's a massive regulatory body breathing down their necks during all this.
Absolutely. The Atomic Energy Regulatory Board, or AERB, is watching every single step. The AERB has to conduct strict, independent safety reviews after every incremental test.
So they can't just move forward whenever they want?
No. They will not allow the public sector company running the reactor, BHAV&A, to increase the power, spin up the steam turbines, or ultimately connect it to the grid until every single safety parameter is flawlessly verified.
So we are looking at months, maybe a year, of careful testing before this thing actually lights a single light bulb. But what is the broader plan for Stage 2? Is Kalpakkam just a one-off science experiment, or is it the template for the future?
It is entirely the template. India has incredibly aggressive expansion plans. The Indira Gandhi Center for Atomic Research isn't resting on its laurels. They are already heavily involved in designing the direct successors to the 500-megawatt PFBR.
Oh, they're already designing the next ones.
Yes. These will be known as the FBR 600 series, standing for Commercial Fast Breeder Reactors, scaled up to 600 megawatts of capacity each.
How many are they planning to roll out?
The current roadmap involves building at least 6 of these FBR 600 units in the coming decades.
6 of them. That's a huge investment.
And to combat the horrific capital costs that killed the American and European programs, they are employing a fascinating economic strategy: co-location.
Co-locating, like putting them together.
Yeah, they plan to build these reactors in pairs, right next to each other at any given site.
But how does building 2 massively expensive reactors side by side save money?
Cost rationalization through shared infrastructure.
Oh.
A huge portion of the cost of a sodium fast reactor isn't the nuclear core itself, it's the auxiliary systems. The specialized argon gas inerting systems, the complex liquid sodium purification plants, the massive security infrastructure, the custom component fabrication facilities.
Right.
If you build 2 reactors in a twin configuration, they can share a lot of these auxiliary systems. You only need 1 sodium purification plant for the site, not 2.
Oh, that makes sense.
It significantly drives down the per-unit capital cost, pushing the technology much closer to being economically competitive with standard coal or water reactors.
Oh, wait, there's a missing piece of the puzzle here that we haven't talked about.
What's that?
We talked about how these reactors breed fuel in a blanket. The U-238 turns into plutonium, or the thorium turns into U-233, but that new fuel is trapped inside solid metal rods inside the blanket.
Yes, it is.
Eventually, you have to take that blanket out of the reactor to get the new fuel to build the next reactor.
Yeah.
How on earth do they do that?
And you've identified the most logistically terrifying part of the entire nuclear fuel cycle. Reprocessing.
Reprocessing, okay.
You are absolutely right. The blanket assemblies must be removed, but when they come out of the liquid sodium, they are intensely, lethally radioactive and physically glowing hot. You cannot just load them onto a standard freight train and ship them across the country to a laboratory.
Yeah, that sounds like a disaster waiting to happen. So what's the solution?
The solution is that alongside the reactors, India has to build co-located fast reactor fuel cycle facilities, or FRFCF. You have to build the chemical processing plant right next door to the reactor.
What exactly happens inside that facility? How do you get the plutonium out of the uranium blanket?
It requires advanced robotic chemistry behind meters of concrete shielding. They take the highly radioactive blanket assemblies, chop them into small pieces, and literally dissolve the solid metal in boiling nitric acid.
Boiling nitric acid. This just keeps getting more intense.
Then, using a highly complex chemical solvent extraction method, a heavily modified version of a process called PURX, they chemically separate the remaining uranium from the newly bred plutonium, or U-233, and separate out the highly radioactive fission waste products.
Okay.
They then take that pure, newly bred fuel, manufacture it into fresh MOX fuel pellets, seal them in new metal tubes, and feed them right back into the reactor.
That sounds like an absolute nightmare to engineer.
It is a massive undertaking,
Yeah.
arguably just as complex and dangerous as the reactor itself. But it entirely closes the loop. This massive FRFCF facility is currently under heavy construction at Kalpakkam as well. When finished, it will be a fully integrated, self-sustaining nuclear campus.
Okay, so that is the brutal, impressive reality of Stage 2. It is moving forward, the liquid sodium template is proven, and they're preparing to scale up and close the chemical loop.
Yep.
Now, I want to talk about Stage 3, because Stage 3 is the promised land.
It is the ultimate realization of the thorium dream.
Exactly. Here's where it gets really interesting for me, because if Stage 2 is finally online after a 22-year delay, what is the actual tangible progress on Stage 3?
A lot, actually.
Really? Can India actually build a thorium power plant? Because as you mentioned earlier, thorium is wet wood. It needs U-233. Has India just been sitting on its hands waiting 22 years for Kalpakkam to finish?
Yeah, and Kamini holds a very unique, highly prestigious distinction globally. It is currently the only operating reactor in the world that uses uranium-233 as its primary fuel.
Wait. If the fast breeder wasn't finished until this year, where did they get the uranium-233 to run Kamini?
They essentially brute forced it. They derived a small amount of U-233 by taking thorium rods and irradiating them in an older heavy water research reactor called CRUS.
So they basically made it the hard way.
Exactly. It was a slow, incredibly inefficient way to breed the fuel, but it gave them enough U-233 to build Kamini and prove that a reactor could safely, sustainably run on it. Kamini proved the fundamental physics of Stage 3 worked perfectly.
Okay, so they proved the physics on a tiny 30-kilowatt scale. But 30 kilowatts barely powers a small neighborhood. What about a massive grid-scale commercial power plant?
The Baba Atomic Research Center, or BIRC, has spent the last 2 decades actively developing the full engineering design for something called the AHWR, the Advanced Heavy Water Reactor.
And what's that?
This is a massive 300-megawatt commercial reactor specifically, ground-up designed to burn a mixed fuel of thorium and plutonium, and eventually thorium and U-233.
And is the design sound?
It is highly mature, and it incorporates incredibly advanced passive safety features.
Passive safety, meaning what?
Well, unlike older reactors that rely on active motorized pumps to circulate cooling water, pumps that can fail if the plant loses power, which is exactly what caused the Fukushima disaster, the AHWR is designed to cool itself naturally.
Naturally.
It relies on the fundamental physics of gravity and thermal convection. Hot water naturally rises, cool water falls. Even in a total station blackout, the reactor core will continuously circulate coolant and safely remove decay heat without a single human intervention or electrical pump.
That is brilliant. Are they looking at any other advanced technologies besides heavy water to burn this thorium?
They are looking at the bleeding edge of global nuclear tech. Research is deeply underway into thorium molten salt reactors, or TMSRs.
Molten salt, how does that work?
It completely reimagines the fuel. In a molten salt reactor, the nuclear fuel isn't a solid metal rod that can melt down or crack. The thorium and uranium are actually chemically dissolved into a liquid salt coolant.
Wait, so the liquid is the fuel?
Yes, the liquid salt is the fuel. This has massive advantages for using thorium efficiently. It operates at high temperatures for great thermodynamic efficiency, but at low pressure, much like the sodium reactor.
What happens if it overheats?
And this is the best part. If the reactor gets too hot, a frozen plug of salt at the bottom of the vessel literally melts, and the liquid fuel safely drains into passive cooling tanks underground. It is physically incapable of a traditional meltdown.
That sounds like science fiction. Is India putting actual money behind this, or is it just academic research?
They are putting massive financial weight behind it. They are heavily investing in these advanced concepts, particularly small modular reactors, or SMRs.
Oh, SMRs? Yeah, that's a huge buzzword right now. Everyone from Bill Gates to the U.S. Department of Energy is talking about them.
They are, and India sees them as vital to deploying thorium across the country quickly. Instead of building massive, custom 1,000-megawatt behemoths that take 15 years to construct, you factory build small, identical 50 or 100-megawatt reactors, ship them on a truck, and plug them in.
Like mass producing them.
Right. In fact, the recent Indian Union budget for 2025-26 outlined a new nuclear energy mission with a massive financial commitment. They allocated 20,000 crore rupees specifically towards the design, development, and deployment of SMRs and advanced reactors.
20,000 crore. That is a serious statement of intent. That is not just research money. That is deployment money.
It is. The stated target is to have at least 5 indigenously designed SMRs operational by 2033. And to facilitate this massive industrial shift, the Indian government enacted a sweeping piece of legislation in 2025 called the Shanti Act.
The Shanti Act. What does that do?
It stands for Sustainable Harnessing and Advancement of Nuclear Energy for Transforming India. Historically, nuclear power in India has been an absolute state monopoly. Only government agencies could touch it. The Shanti Act fundamentally modernizes India's nuclear legal framework.
By doing what?
Crucially, it enables limited, highly regulated private sector participation in the nuclear industry for the first time.
So private companies can start building reactors.
Under strict AERB regulatory oversight, yes. It opens the door for private capital, private manufacturing innovation, and joint ventures to help push these advanced thorium and SMR designs across the finish line faster. The government realized they can't scale up stage 3 alone. They need the industrial might of the private sector.
So let's play this out. If they pull this off, if they successfully commission the Kalpakkam PFBR, build the fleet of 6 FBR 600s, breed the massive stockpiles of U-233, and deploy the advanced heavy water reactors and thorium molten salt reactors across the country, what is the ultimate prize? Let's quantify what true energy sovereignty actually looks like for India.
The math is almost difficult to comprehend. The Indian nuclear establishment has calculated the total energy potential of their economically extractable monazite thorium reserves.
And what's the number?
If fully utilized through Bhabha's 3-stage cycle, that domestic thorium could theoretically generate 500 gigawatts of steady baseload electricity for 4 centuries.
500 gigawatts.
Yeah.
For 400 years.
Let that number sink in for a second. To give you context, India's current installed nuclear capacity today is around 8.7 gigawatts. They are aiming for 100 gigawatts by 2047.
Wow.
Generating 500 gigawatts for 4 centuries represents total, unassailable energy sovereignty for the entire subcontinent. It means total immunity from global uranium supply shocks. It means freedom from the geopolitical leverage of fossil fuel exporting nations in the Middle East or elsewhere. They would never have to fight a war over energy resources again.
And from an environmental perspective, what does this mean for the climate?
It is arguably the only mathematically viable way for a nation of over 1.4 billion people with a rapidly industrializing economy to meet its climate commitments.
Right, the net zero goal.
Exactly. Prime Minister Modi has announced a binding goal for India to achieve net zero carbon emissions by the year 2070. You simply cannot power an economy of that staggering scale, with massive steel plants, data centers, and air conditioning for over 1 billion people on intermittent wind and solar alone.
You definitely can.
You need massive, reliable, clean baseload power that runs 2047 regardless of the weather. Thorium is the absolute key to that 2070 target.
It is an incredible vision. And it all hinges on that one liquid sodium reactor that just woke up in Kalpakkam. When you step back and look at this entire story, why should the average person listening right now care about this?
Right.
Because whether you are passionate about climate change or fascinated by shifting global geopolitics or just love massive engineering marvels, I think the story of the Kalpakkam reactor proves something that feels increasingly rare in the modern world.
What's that?
It proves that long-term, multi-generational strategic planning still exists.
That is a really profound takeaway.
Right. We live in an era of hyper-instinct gratification. Corporations plan for the next quarterly earnings report. Politicians plan for the next election cycle, which is usually 2 to 4 years away. Everything is short-term.
Yeah, everything.
But the Indian scientific establishment sat down in the 1950s, looked at the geology of their beaches, and drafted a complex, highly theoretical master plan that they knew wouldn't bear ultimate fruit for perhaps 80 or 100 years.
They planned for a future they wouldn't even see.
Exactly. The scientists who drafted the plan knew they would be dead before Stage 3 ever switched on. They endured a brutal 22-year delay and massive public criticism on just one machine because they understood it was an indispensable step on a century-long journey.
Yep.
It's a staggering testament to institutional patience.
It is the ultimate long game. They traded short-term financial pain for long-term civilizational security.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final mind-expanding concept that builds on everything we've talked about but addresses the elephant in the room.
The waste.
Exactly. When most people think of nuclear power, their first, most visceral concern isn't a meltdown. It's the waste.
The spent nuclear fuel. The legacy of the atomic age.
Right. The radioactive nightmare of long-lived minor actinides, elements like americium and curium, that stay lethally toxic for tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years.
Right.
The global debate for 70 years has always been, where do we hide it? Do we dig deep geological repositories inside Yucca Mountain? Do we bury it in salt mines in Finland and hope the groundwater doesn't breach it over the next 10 millennia?
It is a massive environmental and political liability.
But consider this. Fast breeder reactors, by their very design, utilize those unmoderated, fast-moving, high-energy neutrons. And physicists have realized that those fast neutrons are exceptionally good at splitting not just uranium and plutonium, but also those exact, long-lived, highly toxic minor actinides.
Because the neutrons have so much kinetic energy, they can force those heavy, stubborn isotopes to fission. They're essentially acting as actinide incinerators.
Exactly. So what if the global solution to the nightmare of nuclear waste disposal isn't burying it deep underground, hoping it doesn't leak into the water table while human civilization rises and falls? What if the actual solution is to dig it up, build more of these incredibly advanced liquid metal fast breeder reactors, and literally feed the waste into the core to be eaten?
Wow.
We could burn it up, transmuting it into shorter-lived, manageable isotopes, while simultaneously extracting massive amounts of electricity from the reaction. We could turn humanity's most toxic, terrifying, long-lasting trash into a centuries-long supply of clean, baseload energy.
It fundamentally flips the script on the environmental impact of nuclear power. It turns a 100,000-year liability into a massive asset.
Turns the toxic ash back into premium firewood. It is pure alchemy, realized through raw engineering perseverance. And that dream all just took a massive critical step forward on the coast of Tamil Nadu. Keep diving deep. We'll catch you next time.